So this discussion is going to look at the structure and function of the body. So this is a really good foundational chapter for this course, but just even in particular for all of you in the health science major, regardless what your focus is in health science, this chapter will definitely give you a good amount of information as foundation of the body and some of the things involved with it. And as I tell students at the beginning of this class, I think that having an awareness of strength and conditioning principles is important regardless of whatever area of concentration you're studying, whether it's athletic training, physical therapy, occupational therapy. There's certainly a lot of information you can still take from this, not only just professionally, but even going into some of your other courses. So this chapter kind of gives a little rudimentary overview of just some, I guess functional anatomy to a degree, and then some other concepts related to the function of the body. So we'll start by looking at the skeletal system. So the skeletal system in general is comprised of 206 bones, and bones kind of have a couple different functions. Okay, so one, bones provide leverage, and that leverage is basically for the tendons to be able to allow the muscles to pull and be able to shorten, contract to allow us to produce movement. They provide support for the structure of the body. Obviously, because without bones, we wouldn't have the support of our body. And in some cases, many cases, provide protection. If we look at, for instance, the ribs and the pelvis and the skull, they provide protection for vital organs. There is actually one other primary function of the skeletal system that's actually, I don't believe it's mentioned in your book, but production of red blood cells as well. So, the skeletal system has some important function in regards to that. Again, from a movement perspective, we're concerned about, again, that leverage as far as how it's provided by muscles. And we're going to talk a little bit about joint structures and kind of how that plays a role with movement. So the first thing we're going to do is, and we're going to kind of be breaking the entire musculoskeletal system down, kind of looking at, big picture and kind of breaking it down a little bit. So one way we kind of classify with the skeletal system is we look at breaking up the axial versus the appendicular skeleton. Okay, so the axial skeleton is essentially your skull, your vertebral column or your spine, your ribs, your sternum. Okay, and then the appendicular skeleton is kind of everything else. Okay, so you could kind of see here if we look at just this basic picture. So skull, the vertebral column, we'll look at it from behind here because you can see it a little bit easier. Okay, the ribs and the sternum, and then the appendicular skeleton is kind of everything else coming off of that. Okay, so your other long bones and what have you. So that's kind of the first way we kind of break down the skeletal system. Now we're going to look at types of joints. So we know our body's comprised of joints, and we have joints that serve different purposes. So typically when you bring up joints, everybody thinks right away of the movable joints that we have, our elbow, shoulder, what have you. But there's other joints throughout the body, and we're going to talk about kind of classifying them. So we start with fibrous joints, which basically allow virtually no movement. So what I want you to do here, and again, this is just to kind of keep this process on the active side, look back in your book and think of examples of these joints. So I'm not going to give them right now. I want you to go and look at that because I want you to kind of be active in this process as we're kind of going through this. So the fibrous joints are what we call synarthrodial joints. They don't allow for any movement. So they are junctions between bones, but they really allow virtually no movement. Then you have cartilaginous joints, or what we call ampiarthrodial joints. So these types of joints do allow some limited motion, but not a whole lot. Okay, and obviously just going by the name, it's kind of a hallmark of this joint is it's going to be filled, a big part of the structure is going to be the cartilage present. And then the synovial joints are what we call our diarthrodial joints. allow for considerable movement. So these are, classically what, most people would think of when they think of joints. Okay, again, your elbow, your knee, those are your synovial joints. So there's particular characteristics of each one of those joints. I kind of want you to be thinking about that as you do your reading. Kind of make some notes to yourself, some other things about these types of joints. So to further kind of break down the types of joints, obviously the synovial joints or the diarthrodial joints are the joints many times we're concerned about as it relates to movement. So we're going to break these down even further. We have uniaxial joints, and they primarily operate as a hinge. And one type of uniaxial joint is a hinge joint, and they rotate about one axis. Okay, an example of that would be the elbow. Okay, so they're the elbow joint is a uniaxial joint. It's also called a hinge joint. There's an example of that there. You have your biaxial joints. They operate in two perpendicular axes. Okay, so an example of that is the wrist joint. Okay, and then you have multiaxial joints. They allow movement in all three planes or axes, and the example of that is the shoulder and the hip. Okay, so if you think of your shoulder and your hip, we're going to talk about movement in the biomechanics chapter. So this one in chapter and the next discussion we're going to have kind of go hand in hand. But these are your types of synovial or your diarthrodial joints. There's going to be another assignment related to this, breaking down the other joints and assessing the other joints of the body. So that'll hopefully help further your understanding of this. Again, the way they get classified is how many axes they can rotate around, and then based upon that, there's also kind of another sort of structural classification. For instance, the elbow joint, we call the elbow joint a hinge joint. Another example of that would be the shoulder. We consider the shoulder a ball and socket joint. So you'll get to work more with that, but this kind of gives you an overview as far as what we'll be looking at as far as those joints of the body are concerned. Okay, we look at the vertebral column. Now, the vertebral column is kind of unique. You kind of have multiple joints and structures involved with the vertebrae. One of probably the most notable things are the discs, and you've probably heard of the intervertebral discs, and they function obviously for shock absorption and kind of allow for movement. But we're going to kind of break down and look at the vertebral column based upon the type of vertebrae you have. So you have 7 cervical vertebrae. These are the vertebrae in the neck region. You have 12 thoracic vertebrae. So that's classically what we think of as the upper back. You have the lumbar vertebrae, which consist of 5 in the low back. Then as we go down further, you get into the sacral vertebrae. Now, the vertebrae in the sacrum are fused. Okay, so when you look at the sacrum, the vertebrae aren't separated by a disc; they're fused together. So that kind of makes up the back portion of the pelvis. So there's 5 of them, and then you have the coccygeal vertebrae, or what make up the coccyx bone. Okay, and this is the tailbone. So when you hear people bruising or breaking their tailbone, that's what they mean. And it's this little part that comes down, and it actually could be anywhere from 3 to 5. Okay, coccygeal vertebrae. Again, these are fused. They fuse as you age. So again, they're not separated by the discs the same way that the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar are separated by. So now we look at the muscular system. So looking at the muscular system, and we're going to break down the macrostructure, kind of big picture, and microstructure, sort of what we did with the skeletal system. So each skeletal muscle and organ contains muscle tissue, connective tissue, nerves, and blood vessels, and we're going to kind of talk about the different layers of muscle and kind of how they all function as far as designing the structure. And so basically what we're looking at is muscles can consist of both contractile and non-contractile tissue. So we know that when a muscle contracts, it shortens, it creates movement. But there's also fibrous connective tissue, and what that's going to do is just provide some tensile strength to the muscle. So we're going to be looking at is not only the portion that causes contraction, but we're also going to look at just the connective tissue part of muscle as we kind of go through this discussion. Okay, so here's a drawing of a muscle, and what we're essentially looking at here, going from, if you kind of go all the way from this part of the picture down, what we're doing is we're further kind of illustrating the different structures of the muscle. So here you have a muscle belly and a tendon. So this is just looking at one big muscle, and then we're basically breaking down the different parts of the muscle kind of as we go along. So we're looking at the different types of connective tissue that surround the muscle, and then we kind of get down to the contractile part, which is essentially down in here that creates, and obviously there's a lot of that within the muscle, but that's what basically where we get our contraction from. So just looking at the connective tissue in general. So we have this outer layer that surrounds the muscle. That's called the epimysium, or the deep fascia. So fascia is essentially just a connective tissue that surrounds the entire muscle. A lot of times people equate fascia to, they call it the saran wrap of the body. Okay, so it's just this tissue that kind of covers the muscle. Deep to that is what's called the perimysium. So you see the perimysium in here. Okay, there's the perimysium. So what that does is it surrounds, so if you look at this picture and the way it breaks down, perimysium surrounds what's called a fasciculus. Okay, and what a fasciculus is a group of individual muscle fibers. So all in here are individual muscle fibers inside the perimysium, and in between those fibers is another layer of connective tissue called the endomysium. Okay, so going from superficial to deep, you have the epimysium, perimysium, endomysium. Okay, the different layers of the skeletal muscle. So the endomysium is going to be what surrounds each individual muscle fiber. Okay, and you can kind of see that as this picture is further teased out. This is a single muscle fiber right here. Okay, so that's a single muscle fiber. Okay, inside the muscle fiber, you can see you have what's called a myofibril, and then you also have the myofilaments. So this is where when we're going to talk about contraction, and the idea behind contraction is through something called the sliding filament theory. You'll get to see how the filaments work in providing shortening of the muscles. So another important thing to kind of note about this, the diagram and kind of muscle. So muscle fibers, the cells have a striated appearance. So you'll hear that term muscle striation. They get that because of the general appearance of the muscle fiber. Now, if we kind of come back up over here, so the tendon is what attaches the muscle to the bone. And with muscles, you're going to have two attachments. So you typically talk about a proximal attachment, or an attachment closer to the midline, and a distal attachment, which is further from the midline. Now, when we talk about the trunk, we don't talk necessarily, you could use the terms proximal and distal, but it gets a little bit harder because you're kind of getting close to the midline at the trunk. At the trunk, we just refer to it as an inferior and a superior attachment. Okay, so when we look at the tendons and their attachments, we kind of look at those two different structures. Now here's an important part of this. So we're going to integrate the nervous system into the muscular system. So in order for muscles to contract, they have to receive input from our nervous system. Okay, so here what you have is, you look here, what's called a motor unit. We have motor nerves in the body. So here's a picture of a motor nerve, and it's innervating a muscle. So in other words, when you get any type of muscle to contract to produce an action, it's got to get input from the nervous system. So a motor unit, so just to define what a motor unit is is a motor unit consists of a motor neuron, which is what you're looking at in the picture, and the fibers of the muscle that it innervates, okay? And they're typically a group of muscle fibers. They're somewhere, you know, typically they say around several hundred of muscle fibers per motor unit. So basically, this is the motor nerve here, and this motor nerve is going to innervate fibers within this muscle, okay? And here you have the different parts of the motor nerve. So you have the dendrites. So dendrites are going to bring information to the nucleus of the cell body. This is the nerve cell here. And then you have what's called the axon. The axon is going to take that information away from the nerve cell and then innervate the individual muscle, okay? And where it innervates at is what's called the neuromuscular junction. So the input from this motor nerve is going to stimulate whatever muscle fibers, however many muscle fibers in this muscle you will get. Now, in any individual muscle, you'll have multiple motor units, okay? So this is just kind of a theoretical muscle here, but there could be a bunch of other motor nerves like this innervating this muscle, bringing in different muscle fibers. So, this could be a muscle that maybe has, let's just say for the sake of discussion, there might be, let's say, 10 motor units. So basically what that would be saying is there would be 10 of these nerves innervating this muscle, all with their own group of muscle fibers. And here you have the muscle fiber, okay? So the individual muscle fiber. And again, look back at that big picture of the muscle so you can make sure you continue to orientate yourself to what it is you're looking at. But there's some important structures here that we want to look at. So if you have here, you have the sarcoplasm and the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So sarcoplasm basically contains all the protein filaments, the proteins, glycogen, fat particles, enzymes that the muscle leaves, and then specialized organelles like the mitochondria and like the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which we'll kind of talk about, what those different structures mean as far as the function of the muscle fiber. And also it's important. So you look here, you have the myofibrils. So if you look in here, so each muscle fiber is made up of multiple myofibrils. So those myofibrils make up most of the sarcoplasm. And inside those myofibrils, remember I said we're just breaking down tissue more and more and looking at the different functions. Inside the myofibrils are what are called myofilaments. So there's myofilaments, okay, and those myofilaments are called actin and myosin, and that's the smallest contractile unit, which is called the sarcomere, okay, and we'll get to see that when we kind of break down that sliding filament theory, which is coming up next, which kind of explains how muscle shortening and contraction occurs when we go to produce movement.
So here we're looking further at the muscle, kind of going to the, kind of breaking it down even further. So if you look here, so this looks similar to that bigger picture that I showed earlier. And again, we kind of tease out these different areas of the muscle. So now we're going all the way down to the myofibril, and we're looking at the contractile portion of the muscle with the actin and myosin filaments. So we're breaking down the myofibril further into a myofilament. And within the filaments, you have two different types of filaments. You have the thin actin and you have the thick myosin filaments. And these filaments are what give the muscle its striated appearance. These are also the structures that move, if you will, during what we call the sliding filament theory, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So when our muscles shorten to create contraction, these filaments slide over one another. So you see this broken down even a little bit further. So here's your sarcomere. So the sarcomere is the smallest contractile unit of the muscle. So you can see how far the muscle's kind of getting down to this smaller and smaller level here with the actin and myosin filaments. So they're showing you the actin and myosin and what they look like. And what essentially happens is when muscle contraction happens, the actin actually slides over the myosin. So when you look at these, they're showing you here the cross bridge formation. the actin filaments actually slide over the myosin. Now, there's a couple areas of interest to note. There's the what they call you'll hear sometimes them call the A band and the I band. So the A band contains the myosin, and that's the darker structure. The I band is the lighter one, that contains the actin. There's the structure called the Z line, which you can see on here as well. This is the Z line right here. And then you have what's called the H zone. The H zone is basically going to be in the center of the sarcomere. So you can kind of see that over here. Here's your H zone in here when we're looking at this individual sarcomere. So what essentially happens is the actin slides over the myosin, which causes the size of the H zone to decrease as the actin slides over the myosin. The Z lines get pulled towards the center. Okay, so the Z lines that you see right here get pulled into the center. So the process of the sliding filament theory, which we're going to talk about next, basically creates that action of the actin sliding over the myosin and producing those structural changes in the muscle. So with the muscular system, again, we need first, in order for the muscle to contract, the first thing that has to happen is you have an action potential. Okay, so all an action potential is a discharge from the motor nerve signals that signals the release of calcium. Okay, so we need calcium for muscle contraction. Calcium gets released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it's that structure inside the myofibril, into the myofibril, and that causes tension to develop. And that tension is based upon the sliding filament theory of muscle contraction. So what this theory states that the actin filaments at the end of the sarcomere slide inward, just what we talked about on the previous slide, pulls the Z lines towards the center and shortens the muscle fiber. So we start with an action potential. The action potential releases calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and you end up getting this shortening contraction. And an action potential is essentially like an electrical nerve impulse. That's essentially what it is. So that kind of starts this whole process of the sliding filament theory. And you're going to have multiple phases of the sliding filament theory as you kind of go through that. So we're going to be outlining that in the upcoming slides. So here's an example of what the structures look like in a stretched muscle. So if we lengthen the muscle, okay, again, look at all your structures. So again, orientate yourself, and again, you're probably going to have to go back and look at these. So it's important to go back, look at the different structures, kind of understand where they fall and what their responsibilities are, okay? So again, here you have your A and I band, okay? So the A band contains your myosin filament, your I band has your actin filament, here's your Z line, here's your H zone. So this is we're essentially looking at a sarcomere right here, okay? This is a sarcomere, this is a contractile unit, okay? So in a stretched muscle, so if you think about this, the muscle's now elongated, so it's not shortened, it's elongated. So you could see the actin and myosin are a little are pulled apart, they're a little bit away from the other. The I bands in the H zone are elongated. Now, with this, there's low force potential due to the fact that you don't have what's called a cross bridge. So we're going to talk about this. When a muscle shortens and contracts and starts to produce force, you form what's called a cross bridge. Well, there's reduced cross bridge actin alignment because of the fact there's so much separation here and the muscle's lengthened. Okay, so this is an example of a stretched muscle, low force potential. Okay, now you notice the difference, okay? So now you notice that this, just like we talked about, okay? Look where the actin filaments went to, okay? So change in the Z line, the H zone is smaller now because the actin has slid over the myosin, okay? So this is when a muscle's contracted, okay? And here it's contracted partially. The I bands and the H zones are shortened. Now you're getting greater force potential. And the reason why you're getting the greater force potential at this point is because of the cross bridge alignment. So now what you end up have is a greater potential for force, because now you can start to get that cross bridge formation in here with the actin and myosin filament. Here's full contraction. Okay, so the fully contracted muscle. Now, when a muscle's fully contracted, you now actually have, again, reduced force potential, and the reason for that is because you're basically using up all your cross bridges. Okay, so it's really under the partial contraction where you're getting a more optimal ability to produce force. Here you're going to have low force potential, but again, what you could see is what happens when the muscle's fully shortened. So if you look at this compared to what the previous slides look like, you could see the dynamic change as far as, you know, where the actin is, the myosin, the Z lines, what that all means, and those other structures that we talked about. Okay, so here we get into kind of the stages involving the sliding filament theory. So all these anatomical structures that we discussed in discussing the myosin and actin filaments and their movement is all going to we're going to get into a little bit more detail as far as the steps. So again, this is probably going to be something you're going to have to go back and look at again, you know, between, you know, listening to this recording and also kind of just reviewing in the text, because there's some physiology involved. But you know, you'll get to know the major steps involved here. So the resting phase. So during the resting phase, there's little calcium present. All the calcium is bound in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So there's very few myosin cross bridges bound to the actin. Okay, so actin and myosin can interact a little bit at rest, but for the most part, until that calcium gets released and there's some other actions that take place, there's pretty much weak bonding, and that's when the muscle's pretty much at rest. The excitation, contraction, coupling phase is when calcium gets released, it binds with a protein called troponin, and that causes a shift in another protein called tropomyosin, and that's when you're going to get myosin attaching to actin and the actin getting pulled towards the center. Okay, and again, the muscle force produced is related to the number of myosin cross bridges bound to actin, so that'll dictate the amount of force. But this is where you're actually getting the beginning of those filaments starting to slide over one another. Okay, so the action potential has come to the muscle, calcium has been released, and you're starting to get the coupling occurring. During the actual contraction phase, this is where the pulling action, or what they call the power stroke, comes from. Now you're going to start to use energy sources. Your energy source is going to come from what's called from your immediate energy source, your adenosine triphosphate. That's your immediate source of energy. So a good example of that would be if you go and do a vertical jump, try to jump one time as high as you can, the energy you're going to use for that's going to come from ATP. Okay, so ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is going to break down into adenosine diphosphate. Okay, and that's going to produce the power stroke for the pulling action. As long as calcium is bound to troponin, you're going to have contraction. Now, as time goes on, you may need to use other energy sources. So depending upon the length of the muscle contraction and the intensity, you may also start to include the glycolytic and oxidative energy metabolism. So those are your other energy systems. So again, ATP will supply it initially. As time goes on, depending upon the intensity and how long you hold it for, you may need other energy sources. Then you get into the recharging phase. So muscle shortening is only going to happen when that sequence of calcium binding to troponin and the coupling of the myosin cross bridge with actin and the power stroke happens. So again, and this could be repeated over and over again as long as calcium is available from the myofibril and as long as ATP is available. Once those energy sources start to break down, you're eventually going to get into the relaxation phase. But during the recharging phase, you know, you could continue to have this process happen as long as sufficient energy is present for the muscle contraction. Then you get into the relaxation phase. So this is when the stimulation from the motor nerve stops. Calcium is basically going to get taken back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. You're going to get resetting of the myosin head position, and that's basically going to put the muscle back into a resting state. Okay, so those are the 5 phases. Again, it's important to kind of see that. Your book talks about the steps of muscle contraction. It just talks about some of the events that occur when the that we just talked about, beginning with the resting phase. So this is basically how muscle contraction will happen, starting for the different phases.